And here we are, starting Unit 7, which is really a continuation of everything that we've talked about in Unit 6, or at least in the same time period. Unit 6 was domestic policy, meaning issues within the United States. And what we will be looking at in Unit 7 is foreign policy. Chapter 20 is the exact same time period that we looked at with the progressive and the populist at the end of the 1800s and into the turn of the century in the early 1900s. But then Unit 7 continues with that, and we get into the Great Depression, the New Deal, and then ultimately we'll end up with World War II. So there are 3 different wars that we'll be talking about, actually 4 different wars that we'll be talking about in Unit 7, and a lot of different policy changes, especially foreign policy. We've said from the very beginning, if we go all the way back to the founding with George Washington's administration, that our foreign policy has been really directed by this idea of staying out of conflict, neutrality. Remember the George Washington's neutrality proclamation with the French Revolution, that the US was not going to get involved in that, stay out of alliances. That changes. This is where it changes, is in Unit 7. The US certainly had been involved in wars prior to the world wars, or prior to joining NATO and the other alliances after World War II. But those wars that the US participated in, and including World War I and then ultimately World War II, is after an effort to remain neutral has been challenged, okay? And the US is prompted to enter those wars. So that will change at the end of World War II, as we will see in Unit 7. So we'll go ahead and start today with Chapter 20. And as I mentioned to you before, this is it's an important time period for sure, because there are a lot of changes with foreign policy. Okay, so hopefully you are able to see Chapter 20 here. And the time period is 1890 to 1918. So this will take us up through World War I. And then in the remaining chapters in Unit 7, we'll get into the Great Depression, New Deal, and World War II. All right, so we begin to expand. We begin to look at world markets as opportunities to sell all of these new products that we have created here in the United States. And you can see with this political cartoon, Columbia's Easter bonnet. And Columbia, again, is talking about this idea of the United States and Lady Liberty and the idea of democracy. And then by referring to this as an Easter bonnet, again, you're bringing in this idea of Christianity, and with expansion and colonization into other parts of the world that may not be areas where there are large proportions of Christian believers. This is something that's also weighing in on part of that expansion. It's the idea of expanding American culture, this idea of the native, white Protestant culture that becomes part of the expansion, especially during this early period. And notice that what she has in her bonnet here is world power through military might. We've got these brand new battleships that are going to be built, and then here coming out of the smoke is expansion. Expansion has been part of the United States. We've talked before about Manifest Destiny, which is this addition of the land holdings of the United States. And that, excuse me, that expansion had grown when we ended the American Revolution, then with the Louisiana Purchase, then with the annexation of Texas, the negotiation for Oregon, and then finally with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War and the Gadsden Purchase. So we completed that North American continental expansion of the United States. And so that we had said in this early period in the 1840s was Manifest Destiny, the addition of the land holdings into the United States. What we're going to be looking at now is imperialism, where we're not bringing in new states, but we're going to be expanding our influence into other areas of the world, and in some cases by acquiring colonies, as we will see. So the age of imperialism is not just going to be unique to the United States. Other countries in the world are also adding to their possessions. And I know in world history you studied for the Scramble for Africa that we'll look at in a minute, But the United States really gets into this imperialistic approach later than many of the other European countries. So here you've got Uncle Sam, and he's planting the US flag in various places around the world. So the European effort for colonization has definitely expanded into Asia and into Africa. With all of these countries that are basically carving up Africa for their own interest, what they're seeking from this is usually going to be resources. The development of resource acquisition out of other places to add to what Europe is able to then produce in their own industrial settings. There are only 2 countries in Africa that remain free from European annexation or colonization, and that would have been Ethiopia and Liberia. So those are the only 2 in the scramble for Africa that remain independent. You've also got more colonization and more influence of European powers in Asia as well at the same time. So this is definitely a change of events. So here you can see the only 2 that are left independent from control. We can see elements of some of these European traditions, even in Africa today, with languages that are spoken and various aspects of culture that still remain constant in some of these areas that had previously been controlled by European powers. Of all of these empires, the British Empire was certainly the largest. And the phrase, it was true that the sun never set on the British Empire at that time. This was under Queen Victoria's leadership. And you can see examples of all of these different colonies that Great Britain had control of. And when you look at the 24-hour clock, the time zones, that there is truly a possession of the British in every one of those time zones. So they spanned the world for sure. And it was largely due to the efforts of Queen Victoria, who had a very, very long reign, powerful reign in Great Britain. All right, so the United States and Japan begin to consider whether or not to get involved in the imperial expansion that many of the European countries were getting involved in. And again, they're kind of late to the game. So these are some points that will fuel the US to actually take that that step to get involved in other areas of the world. And it's going to be primarily for opening up markets to sell our products, okay? So mostly people get involved in imperialism for economic reasons. And usually it's going to be about acquisition of raw materials and natural resources. Think about when Great Britain first colonized North America with the American colonies. Those colonies were there to extract resources for Great Britain. And we talked about that as the idea of mercantilism, where the colony existed really for the economic benefit of the mother country. That's usually what's going to be happening here, this extractive economy where you're pulling out those natural resources. But the United States doesn't really need that because we have plenty of resources here in North America. What we need is a new market to be able to sell our products to, right? We're able to produce more goods than we have people to consume them. So this is why the economic focus for the United States during this period of expansion is that we want to sell products to other countries, not necessarily extract those raw materials from them. Okay, another reason that countries get involved in imperialism is to grow their military power and their strength. You've got defensive reasons, right? If you've got a strong military positioned around the world, then that helps to protect you defensively. And the new technology is really expanding, especially the Navy of the United States. We have new steel-plated battleships. We're going to have a brand new fleet that ends up during this time period under Theodore Roosevelt's leadership. And a lot of the recommendations about military expansion and imperialism come from this important book by Alfred Thayer Mahan. And it's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And he does a good expose of tracing back all of the large powers of the world throughout world history. And one thread that they had in common was they all had a strong naval fleet. And so this was something that Alfred Thayer Mahan was recommending that the US take into consideration is that military practice, military power, especially in your Navy, is going to provide more protection for your country. So these were some of the recommendations that came out of his book, is that the United States absolutely had to update its fleet. The British had by far the most superior Navy in the world, and the United States needed to catch up to that. We needed more foreign military bases. We needed to have positions within our region to protect the United States, especially in the Caribbean. We needed to be able to stop any sort of outside threat before it comes ashore in the United States. And the Caribbean was key to that, to have foreign military bases. And he also recommends that to be able to monitor and protect the vast territory that now belongs to the United States on the Pacific coast and on the Atlantic coast, instead of having to rely on going all the way around South America with our naval fleet, we have to have a cut through here with a canal through Panama, because that would be the most narrow point to connect both sides through water. And he also recommends that Hawaii is strategic for U.S. Influence and protection and trade, because if you look at its position, here is North America, here is Asia, and Hawaii is almost exactly in the middle. And so this would provide a fabulous refueling station for the United States fleet as we begin to expand. And so having control of Hawaii allows our naval fleet to have much more of a powerful presence in the Pacific. So keep those recommendations in mind, because all of these are going to be fulfilled, and they're going to be fulfilled mostly by Theodore Roosevelt, who was a huge, huge fan of this particular book by Alfred Thayer Mahan. And when he gets positioned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then Acting Secretary of the Navy, he's going to implement a lot of these different provisions. Okay, and then the final area of imperialism that many people look to is this idea of just national superiority, that the United States, Americans and their technology and their prosperity begin to view themselves as superior to many other people around the world. So here again, we use this term social Darwinism. We had previously applied that in Unit 6 with businesses and the survival of the fittest, the most stable businesses and the strongest businesses. Those were the ones that were going to survive. The weaker ones were going to be the ones who failed or got taken over. So you can apply that very same approach to imperialism, where you've got a strong nation that is able to go in and take control or colonize another group of people. Well, if they were as advanced, then they would be able to stand up and defend themselves. But because they are not as advanced under this idea of social Darwinism, that these more superior powers are coming in to get control of them, whether it is an issue of military sophistication, technological sophistication, or even in the case of many of these countries that get taken over, it's going to be an issue of race and an idea of racial superiority as well. The United States is worried that as Europe is expanding its influence, that the US might be being left behind. And what are we going to do if we don't have access to various markets in these emerging areas in Africa and in Asia that we can't trade in? And so many people begin to say we've got to keep up. Notice this phrase over here, American exceptionalism. I want you to really pay attention to this idea, because this is a term that is fueling the social Darwinists and the idea that the United States can bring sophistication, can bring uplift, can bring other places into a more modern way of life. And then again, notice the imagery here in the image, America, a shining city upon a hill. That goes all the way back to John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they were, as Puritans, trying to show the other parts of the world that this was the true and the best way of life, and that God favored them. And so they're believing here that God's favoring the United States, and this idea of American exceptionalism should be a symbol to the rest of the world on how to live. Again, so what do you think about this approach? It could be viewed as very, very arrogant. It could certainly be viewed in many ways as racist, depending on how it will play out. So you've got to kind of weigh this idea of expansion with responsible growth of the nation. So this is a cartoon that is referencing a phrase, the white man's burden, which comes out of the notion of American exceptionalism, that these, in social Darwinism, that the British and the Americans have a social responsibility to uplift people who are not as sophisticated as them. So again, sophisticated, that's going to be their point of view during this time. So look at the image here. You've got Uncle Sam representing the United States. You've got this British man who are climbing up all of these hazardous obstacles, barbarism, oppression, ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, and they're carrying on their backs, literally. These would be representing, here you've got Cuba, which we'll talk about in a minute, the Philippines, other areas where the United States will end up acquiring colonies. You've got the British who will acquire colonies in Africa and in Asia. And they're moving up all of these treacherous obstacles towards civilization. So what they're saying is that they are doing all of these people a favor by bringing them towards civilization out of their more limited way of life. Now, did anybody bother to ask the people who were being colonized if this was something that they wanted? No. And so again, it's this very, very self-centered approach that is looking towards expansion and imperialism. We can also look to the expansion and the migration of people for from areas that become more crowded and competitive for work. We can begin to look towards the frontier for those opportunities. And Frederick Jackson Turner had this idea of the frontier thesis before, where people are moving for opportunities into the West that has been added into the United States possession. But once that had been fulfilled, then you could also apply this idea, the frontier thesis, to imperialism, that are these colonies, are these adding to the opportunities for Americans as well. We begin this in the mid-1800s with Commodore Matthew Perry, that will go into Japan and begin to open up trade with the Japanese that have been a very, very closed off civilization for hundreds of years. And this is something that when he shows up with his battleships to open up trade here, I don't know that the Japanese really had much of a choice in the matter, but this is where we start this expansion, this involvement in opening up overseas trade. During the Civil War, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, this was when he purchased Alaska. We've already talked about this briefly, but the purchase of Alaska was, again, looking towards expansion, looking towards that Pacific coastline and having American influence there. There's also going to be a movement by the United States, as we had seen in the Monroe Doctrine, to really kind of be an influence in Latin America. And by 1889, we will have this Pan American Conference, as it's called, where the Latin American countries will come together, and there's going to be an effort to connect them with this Pan American highway system. So you're going to have a road that's going to connect the United States border at Texas all the way through Mexico, Central America, and into South America. And that's going to allow for easier trade and movement of goods. Okay, so this is, again, the United States leading this approach with these Latin American nations for connection, transportation connectivity during this early period. All right, now Hawaii is where the story starts to get a little more complicated. There were many American landowners in Hawaii, which was an independent nation at this point. And you had many Americans who had bought land in Hawaii, and they were growing sugarcane, which was a very, very lucrative commodity at the time. And they were selling that sugarcane back to the United States and making significant profits. And the king on the island of Hawaii had accepted these American businessmen and allowed them to continue to buy up this land. And there was this understanding of the American sugarcane going back into the United States, and it was not subject to a tariff at this early period. But then that changes as time goes on. So these were American investors. And then McKinley comes in, and the McKinley tariff, this is kind of where we've got a period of transition happening in Hawaii, where the king is going to die. His sister comes to power, who has a totally different view of American influence there. And the sugarcane ended up becoming part of the tariff, meaning that the profits that they're making are not as much as they had previously been. So this is a problem for these American businessmen in Hawaii. So here's the king, who had been more accommodating to these American influences on his islands, King Kalakaua. And he died suddenly. And when he died, his sister became the ruler, and her name is Queen Liliuokalani. I like to call her Queen Lil because her name is hard to pronounce. And she was very, very upset with white power, the planter class that was in Hawaii. They had actually started taking political control in Hawaii as well. And she was very, very resentful of that, and was no longer going to allow these Americans to control politics there. And so she is a problem for them. And with the support of the United States, these Americans are going to come in and overthrow the queen. And so once they overthrow the queen, then these American businessmen are in control of Hawaii. And this happens in 1893. Remember, this was the time of the economic decline that was going on in the United States. We're starting to see the populist movement. That was all happening at once. So here in Hawaii, we've got a lot of instability, but then the Americans will overthrow the queen, put themselves in power. And Sanford Dole, if you've ever heard of Dole pineapple, there is a huge Dole pineapple plant in Hawaii. And this is where it started, is with Sanford Dole. And he becomes the leader of this new government. Now, I ask the question, does he truly want to remain an independent nation, or what does he actually want? He wants to be annexed by the United States. Doesn't this remind you of exactly what happened with Texas, where Texas won its independence from Mexico, but really the Americans who were living there were wanting annexation so that they could avoid those tariffs that would have made their products less profitable. So Sanford Dole is wanting to be annexed, wanting Hawaii to be annexed, and the queen has no influence anymore. So when we look at Hawaiian annexation, Benjamin Harrison was president initially when this was first coming up. But you'll remember that Grover Cleveland comes in 1893. So Benjamin Harrison, who was a Republican, had said, yes, this will be just fine. We can annex Hawaii. You won't be subject to the tariff. We can still have this tariff on other outside products, and everything will be great and wonderful. But Harrison doesn't stay in office. Grover Cleveland comes in, and Grover Cleveland is going to look at the situation, really take a poll of the Hawaiian people or investigate what's going on in Hawaii. And it becomes quite clear that the Hawaiian people have no interest in becoming part of the United States. And so he therefore says, no, I will not annex Hawaii, and issues an apology, and things are still in limbo. But later in 1898, when William McKinley is in office, this is in McKinley's, during his term as president, war is going to break out with Spain. And one of the main areas of fighting in the war with Spain is in Spanish possessions in Cuba and in the Philippines. So if we look over here on the map, here is the position of the United States. Here's the location of Hawaii. And then you've got the Philippines, which are going to be here in East Asia. So this would be a very strategic location for the United States to have control of for military refueling if we're fighting against the Spanish in the Philippines. So as that war breaks out in 1898, William McKinley says, absolutely, we're going to annex Hawaii, and it will come in as a territory. Now, it's not yet a state. Hawaii will not become a state until the 1950s. Same thing with Alaska. Those two possessions remain territories until the 1950s. All right, so here's where trouble starts to brew with Spain. And you'll remember that Spain has been a country in decline for a while. We've talked about that before, where with Pinckney's Treaty, when they were trying to negotiate access to the port at New Orleans, and they end up gaining the free right of passage there in the Mississippi River and all of that with Spain, because Spain doesn't want to lose their territory. Well, Spain ends up losing it to the French anyway, and then they've got Mexico still until the Mexican-American War. I mean, the Mexican War for Independence, and so they've lost that. So really, all they've got left by this time in the turn of the century are the Philippines, the island of Puerto Rico, the island of Cuba, and the island of Guam. That is it. That is all they have left. Now, you think about all of the prosperity that Great Britain is experiencing, all of the vast imperial possessions that Great Britain has acquired under Queen Victoria. France is also in the mix here with a lot of international possessions and a lot of affluence. Spain is the one who is desperately in decline, and they want to stay in control. In particular, Cuba is a country that is also heavily involved in sugarcane production, which is financially important for them, and they want to hang on to these possessions. Well, to hang on to them, they end up really using a lot of very strict oversight. And the people of Cuba become quite resentful of Spanish control, because Spain sends in these military officials that are brutal. And there is a revolutionary movement that is growing in Cuba, and it's led by this man, Jose Marti, who wants Cuban independence from Spain. And eventually he has enough people on his side that he declares war on Spain in 1895. So it's basically a revolutionary war. So you can kind of think of this as these patriots wanting independence from a colonizer who they believe is unfair. And in the midst of this revolutionary war between Cuba and Spain, there are also American landowners in Cuba who are also growing sugarcane. So you've got Americans who are now physically in the middle of this conflict. Okay, the Spanish are going to send this leader, General Weyler, to go and get control of the situation in Cuba. And when he gets there, he has a hard time figuring out, well, who's loyal to Spain and who's loyal to Jose Marti. And the only way he can figure out to sort this out is to open up concentration camps where he isolates people to prevent them from spreading their ideas to other parts of the community and other parts of the island. And he uses very, very brutal tactics. I mean, look at his nickname. His nickname is the Butcher. So that kind of gives you an idea of what he's doing here. And this is causing even more unrest. People who had not really sided with Jose Marti in the past, when General Weyler comes in, this absolutely turns them towards Cuban independence. But again, let me remind you, you've got Americans who are living among all of these people who are now embroiled in a war. Here are the conditions in the concentration camps. It was horrific, horrific. Mass starvation was going on here. It's not going to be the same as the concentration camps that we know Hitler imposed on Jews in World War II in terms of mass extermination. But people died in large numbers in these camps because of lack of food and clean water. So stories of this start to be reported in the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. We mentioned them in Unit 6. And their idea of yellow journalism. And remember that the term yellow journalism is really talking about these exaggerated headlines that were trying to sell more and more and more newspapers. So when these stories come out of what General Weyler is doing and what the Spanish are doing to people in Cuba, I think many Americans kind of viewed it as yet another one of these exaggerations. It's sort of like that story, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, that now that it's really true and accurate, people just kind of brushed it aside and didn't necessarily pay attention to it or take it as seriously as they probably should have. So again, the yellow journalism weighs in very, very heavily on what's happening in Cuba. Now, there are also stories that come out where they're saying that American ships are being searched by Spanish leaders and that they're strip searching American women on these passenger ships. And that kind of starts to stir up a lot of unease, right? So here we've got this Spaniard searching women on American steamers. That, of course, would not go over very well. And then you've got all of these cartoons depicting situations related to the war. So McKinley is going to issue a statement, and he's going to warn Spain that they have got to make peace with Cuba, okay? Because again, this is interfering with American economic efforts to grow sugarcane there. And when America puts this warning on Spain, Spain comes in and does realize that General Weyler has gone way overboard. And so he gets pulled out of Cuba and is going to be returned to Spain. And Spain is going to offer to allow Cuba some sort of self-government while they're still a colony of Spain. But that road to independence is too far established in Cuba. So they're not going to accept reform. Anything short of independence is not acceptable to Jose Marti and his followers. So things get more tense. But again, Americans are still there. So McKinley sends one of our brand new fancy battleships, the USS Maine, to go and just park in the harbor of Havana in case the situation gets out of control, that our military would be there to evacuate American citizens and protect American citizens. So we don't have US forces on the ground. We have not taken sides with Jose Marti. We have not taken sides with Spain. We are there to protect American interests, according to William McKinley, okay? About that time, February of 1898, look at the timing of this. So February of 1898, Enrique de Lome, who is the Spanish ambassador to the United States, is writing a letter back to Spain. And he is incredibly critical of William McKinley, calls him a weak and stupid man. And so William McKinley is openly criticized in this letter, and the letter is seized by American officials and it is turned over to the newspapers. And when the contents of this letter come out, and it's clear that this Spanish ambassador is not respecting the American president, Americans are angry. And so when we say it fuels US jingoism, jingoism is a fancy word for pride in the United States. It's like another word for nationalism, but it's more like defending your own. I like to use this example. William McKinley was not, a lot of people were not a fan of William McKinley, including Theodore Roosevelt. Once Theodore Roosevelt was vice president, he was known to have been very critical of William McKinley as well. But when someone from the outside is critical of the US president, that's a whole different story. And I like to compare this. If you've got little brothers and little sisters, you know, you may fight like cats and dogs with your little brother, your little sister. But when there's a bully down at the bus stop who is harassing your little brother, your little sister, that is a whole different situation. You are not going to be willing to accept that. You're going to defend that little brother, little sister at all cost, even though you fight with them all the time and constantly bicker. But that's different when it's something from the outside. And that's what happens here when the DeLome letter is exposed and printed in the newspapers. So the DeLome letter is already kind of setting the American people on edge, and the anger is growing against what is happening with Spain. All right, so that was mid to late February. A few days after this letter is reported in the newspapers, our battleship explodes. Our brand new technologically advanced battleship is blown up. Look at what's left behind. There's nothing here. And you've got hundreds of American soldiers or sailors who lost their lives in the explosion of the Maine. So the battleship Maine's explosion is what will cause people, on top of their already, heightened anger with the DeLome letter at being disrespected, they're demanding that we go to war. So William McKinley wants to make sure. And so he says, we've got to have an investigation. We got to make sure that Spain is truly responsible for this explosion. So they go down, they investigate, and the investigation concludes that there had been a mine planted in Havana Harbor that exploded. And yes, indeed, it was the Spanish leadership's responsibility for this explosion and the loss of American lives. And so, of course, the war declaration is granted almost immediately after that investigation comes out. Now, fast forward to the 1970s, there is a re-examination of the evidence. And it turns out that it probably was not Spain who blew up the battleship. It was probably a horrible, horrible accident, because the design of this particular battleship had coal and the furnaces that were using the coal to fuel the battleship very close to combustible material. And the thought is, after the investigation in the 1970s, that it was just a horrible accident of spontaneous combustion in the fuel chamber down in the belly of the boat. So the explosion happens nonetheless. People are fired up, and the war declaration is established. Now, I need you to definitely emphasize in your notes that when war is declared, there is an amendment added to the war declaration. So by a war declaration, if you go back to the Constitution, the legislature has the power to declare war. So when they vote for that, it's called a war declaration. But in addition to the declaration of war, an amendment was added called the Teller Amendment. And this amendment said that we are entering this war to defend American interest, but we are not entering this war to add to our possessions. We are not looking for financial gain. We are not looking for land claims anywhere in the world. We are defending American interests. So keep that in mind, that we make it very clear in our war declaration in the Teller Amendment that we are not seeking additional possessions. That's not why we're going to war. We're going to war because what's been done to us, okay? So that's in April of 1898. So here is the United States. We've now entered the war with Spain over the situation that has happened in Cuba. Notice on her sign here, she's got on the sign Cuba Libre, which is talking about Cuban freedom, Cuban independence from Spain. And here is the United States kind of using the American flag to protect these Cuban patriots and fight this war against Spain. So the war is on, and guess where the first fighting begins? Okay, so we've got the Teller Amendment. Often the Spanish-American War here in modern times is going to be referred to as the War of 1898. It's the same conflict. This is just kind of an updated name because it's more than just Spain and the United States involved in the war. Cuba is also in the war, and so are the Philippines, because again, that's another colony that Spain had at the time. All right, so fighting actually starts in the Philippines and not in Cuba. So why in the world would that happen? If the battleship Maine exploded in Cuba and the conflict is with Cuba and in Spain's control of Cuba, why would we start fighting in the Philippines? All right, we need to think about it. At the time that Spain was having trouble with Cuba, they were also having trouble in the Philippines with a similar independence movement from the citizens of the Philippines wanting independence from Spain. And that was led by a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. So Spain has had to kind of split their forces to maintain control of the Philippines, while Emilio Aguinaldo and his revolutionary forces were wanting independence, and Jose Marti and his revolutionary forces were wanting independence in Cuba. So with Spain's military fleet split, the US has got to understand that if we go and we fight in Cuba, then we might give Spain time to reconfigure and join up their forces, and it be a more difficult fight. Nobody in the world expects that the US first attack will occur in the Philippines. Everybody assumes it's going to happen in Cuba. So use that to your advantage, the element of surprise, knock out the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, then worry about the forces in Cuba. And that had happened because the US had earlier positioned its fleet in Manila Bay. And so we were primed and ready to go. And as soon as that war declaration comes in, then George Dewey and the American fleet go into the Philippines and defeat the Spanish there. So it's a pretty quick attack, and that is going to take place. Now, think about when we said that McKinley annexed Hawaii. He annexed Hawaii at the very same time that the war with Spain was beginning. Okay, and that was because this was a very strategic location for refueling our battleships, just as Alfred Thayer Mahan had recommended. All right, so the war in the Philippines is under control, very quick, very, very easy. Emilio Aguinaldo and his Patriot forces had assisted the United States, and that part is taken care of. Now the United States is going to land in Cuba. So this is in June of 1898. War declaration was in April. Invasion of the Philippines was in May. Now the invasion of Cuba will be in June. And the first place that we take control of and where we enter Cuba is at Guantanamo Bay. That name may be familiar to you. It's going to be added into our story here in a few minutes. So we arrive at Guantanamo Bay, but our soldiers haven't had much training, right? We've not maintained this large peacetime army. We had hundreds of thousands of volunteers for this war in 1898, but they were only given 3 or 4 weeks of training before they're sent into a combat situation. And I put this uniform here because a lot of what is being used for the uniforms are holdovers from the end of the Civil War. These are wool uniforms. If you've ever been to Florida in June, you know how incredibly hot it is and humid it is. Go even farther south to Cuba in June and fight in a wool uniform out in the open. So the conditions were miserable. And the United States ended up losing more soldiers to disease and problems with dehydration than they did actual combat wounds. So this was a problem. But in the end, the war is going to end up being turned in favor of the United States and won very quickly when the Rough Riders show up. And this was the cavalry unit that we had talked about in chapter 19 that Theodore Roosevelt puts together with his cowboy friends and his polo player fraternity brother friends. And they go into Cuba under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. And they're also going to be assisted by 4 Black regiments as well. And they go into Cuba and very quickly get control of the high ground. And we know when you control the high ground, you control the fighting. And when they get possession of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, that's going to end the war. Spain is going to have no choice. They've already lost the Philippines. They're going to have no choice but to surrender. And so out of this, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the hero. He comes home, gets to be governor of New York, and then eventually vice president under McKinley. So all of this is happening during McKinley's first term. The second term is after all of this heroism of Theodore Roosevelt in Cuba. Okay, so they declare him a war hero, and then he will use that prominence to launch his national political career. Okay, so 2 days afterwards, Spain is trying to escape. We've got a blockade around Cuba. And at that point, the surrender will occur. So the surrender happens in July. When was war declared? April was when war was declared. So April to May, May to June, June to July. So we've got about 3 months or so for this entire war that's fought in the Philippines and Cuba. And we've got the surrender. So with this surrender, the United States also goes close by to Puerto Rico and gets control of Puerto Rico as well, the other of the Spanish possessions. And so at the surrender, okay, we're going to see that the treaty is signed. And we are going to now be in possession of all of the former Spanish possessions. The U.S. is now in possession of the Philippines, of Cuba, of Guam, and of Puerto Rico. And so now we've got to figure out what to do. Well, let's go back. Didn't the Teller Amendment say that we had no intention of maintaining control of Cuba? We're not in this war for possessions. So what do? Do we turn them over and say you're now independent and worry that these other European countries that have already positioned themselves with the scramble for Africa and in Asia are going to come in and take them over? Is that what we're going to allow to happen with these new nations that have been under Spain's control for incredibly large, long amounts of time? That's going to weigh in on the decision as well. Okay. So this Treaty of Paris, here's what happens. Cuba is going to be given its independence, somewhat, largely due to the Teller Amendment, but the U.S. is still going to occupy Cuba, right? We're not leaving anytime soon, but technically they're going to be given their independence here with the Teller Amendment. Puerto Rico and Guam become possessions of the United States. These are still possessions of the United States. The U.S. still has control of both of these territories. And the United States is also going to have the Philippines, but we're going to pay Spain $20 million for annexation. This is kind of a similar arrangement that we saw at the end of the Mexican-American War, where the U.S. paid money for the Mexican cession. All right, so here's the end of it. Now, for this to actually go into effect, the president can't just sign a treaty by himself, or the Secretary of State can't sign a treaty by himself. It has to be ratified by the American government. So we come back, and this launches a huge debate in America about what do we do? Do we become an empire? Do we not? And there are valid arguments on both sides. And so the world is waiting to see what will happen, right? So here's the world watching. What is McKinley and what is the United States going to do now that they are technically an empire? Okay. So those who say that it is a great idea to hang on to these colonies use these arguments as justification. One is that the Philippines, notice where they're located here, would be a fabulous place to use as a launching point to trade with China. Okay, so as China is being carved up by these other countries, the US wants to get involved in that action as well, and the Philippines would be a great place to start from. And then they also are viewing the Philippine people as not being capable of governing themselves. And so the US has got to stay there and monitor what's happening in order for them to be self-sufficient later on. Those who are opposed to it go back to the Declaration of Independence and say, look what the American Revolutionary Movement was about, the very same issues of wanting independence and colonization from an unfair power or unfair treatment from a power that's colonized you. That's what the war was about. That's what the Declaration of Independence was about. They also argue we've got just as many problems at home that are still unresolved with race relations and those other Gilded Age issues. We need to be focusing on all of those domestic policies, not adding to the problems of the United States. And then they're also worried, if we have these territories in our possession, does that allow people from all of these places to flood into the United States and start looking for work? Are they citizens? Do they come in? Do they have access to entry into the United States? And if we're adding more competition for jobs, what's going to happen to wages? What's going to happen to these urban areas? And so they're saying, civilization, look at this cartoon, civilization begins at home. Is the treatment of African Americans civilized? No, in no way. So they're saying if you're trying to show yourself as this superior, more civilized nation, and you're going to go in and provide assistance to these uncivilized people, you need to look at your own house first, that there are some problems there. Eventually, imperialism is going to win out, and the United States is going to maintain control of these possessions. So out of this whole circumstance with Spain, we've got Hawaii, we've got the Philippines, we've got Puerto Rico, we've got Guam, and we kind of still have Cuba as well because our military is still occupying the region. Now, the Philippines, they're not happy. at all, because they have essentially passed from one colonizer to the other and nobody bothered to ask them. So the original leader of the independence movement against Spain, that had actually been an ally of the United States when we invaded in May of 1898, was this man, Emilio Aguinaldo. And when the US begins and passes annexation and possession of the Philippines, he is outraged and he declares war on the United States and independence from the United States. So January of 1899, he declares independence from the United States, and basically they're at war with the United States. The Philippine-American War is significantly longer, significantly more deadly, and significantly more costly in terms of money than the Spanish-American War ever thought about being, okay? So Emilio Aguinaldo is leading this revolutionary movement in the Philippines against the United States, and the US military has to go in and try to put this down. All right, so when the US military arrives there, how do we know who is loyal to the United States and who's loyal to Emilio Aguinaldo? Can we figure that out? No, we can't figure that out very easily. So immediately the United States starts trying to restrict people who we know are Aguinaldo supporters and the Philippine independence movement supporters. And we began to detain them in concentration camps. Isn't this exactly what Spain did to the Cuban people who followed Jose Marti? It's the same thing. And now the United States is doing that as well. So this is a bad look for the United States in the Philippines. By 1901, so remember, this starts in January of 1899. It will take until 1901 for the United States military to finally capture Emilio Aguinaldo. And as we've seen in many of these rebellions before throughout history, is when you remove the leader of the rebellion tends to fall apart. And that's exactly what happens here. So when Emilio Aguinaldo is captured, the war with the Philippines is over, and the United States is now in possession of the Philippines. But again, do the people of the Philippines really want to be part of the United States? So the person who's going to be put in charge of trying to rebuild physically, right? Because we've been fighting a war there. So the infrastructure is destroyed, the schools, the roads, the hospitals, all these kinds of things have all got to be rebuilt. So we've got to put someone in control as a governor of the Philippines who will repair not only the physical destruction from the war, but also the public relations and the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. That's all going to be put together. Now, who's president in 1901? That's Theodore Roosevelt, because remember, McKinley gets reelected in 1900, but then gets assassinated. And so now Theodore Roosevelt is in power when Aguinaldo is captured, and he is going to appoint William Howard Taft. And this is where we start to see Taft and Roosevelt really working strongly together during Roosevelt's administration. And he does a fabulous job here in the Philippines. It's not until after all of this that Taft is going to come in as president, and then that destroys the relationship. So at this point, Taft and Roosevelt are totally in line with their vision for influence around the world. So Taft does a decent job of using the military for rebuilding projects in the Philippines and trying to at least smooth over somewhat the bad reputation that the United States has in the Philippines. And I'm not going to say that it's totally repaired, but he does as good of a job as could be expected under the circumstances. So the question becomes, all of these people who now live in these 4 new possessions of the United States, Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and then, Cuba, not really, because Cuba's technically independent, but are they automatically citizens of the United States? What protections, what rights do they have? And that ends up going to the Supreme Court in a series of cases that we're going to call the insular cases. Insular is the adjective form of the word island. So it's like of the islands, the insular cases. And the question is, does the Constitution apply to new possessions of the United States? So where we're planting our flag in new colonies, do constitutional rights automatically become attached to that flag or that possession? And here's the ruling of the court. And I would put an emphasis in your notes about this. Look what it says. The court ruled that constitutional rights are not automatically extended to territorial possessions, and that the power to decide whether or not to grant such rights belonged to the Congress. So they kind of go back to the way states were added from the previous territories that had come into the United States. Remember that Northwest Territory, the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance of 1785? That was a congressional plan that once a certain population was reached, then they could have their own local legislature, and then they could apply to become a state, and and the application goes to the Congress, and then they approve it or deny it as such. Well, these places don't need to have those population requirements, but they focus on this idea of the legislature of the United States, the US Congress, approving or not approving applications for statehood. Okay, so that is where the court is saying that it is not automatic that these new territories around the world are going to follow those same steps to statehood. Okay, so Puerto Rico, after the war, by 1900, they're going to be allowed their own local government where they can elect their own leadership, but US leaders are going to be in charge of that. They're going to have the right to veto any policies passed by the Puerto Rican government. They're going to have a governor position in Puerto Rico, et cetera. So that's going to be in the Foraker Act. Then in 1917, which is going to be about the time of World War I, the Jones-Shafroth Act is going to provide citizenship to Puerto Rican people. So they become citizens of the United States, but not a state. So Puerto Rico and the other 4 territories for that matter, because we've got the Mariana Islands as well and American Samoa. Those are all territories of the United States. We've got Puerto Rico, Guam, Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. Those are the 4 territories that we have in the United States today. Philippines end up becoming independent after World War II that we'll get into in a second. So what is their status today? All right, so here's where things lie today with Puerto Rico and the others. We've got the fact that they're US citizens, so they are entitled to protections of US citizens. They pay federal taxes, federal tax, Social Security and Medicare, which means that they can draw those services from the federal government, Social Security and Medicare, but they do not pay income tax. So they don't pay federal income tax in Puerto Rico, but they pay other federal taxes such as Social Security and Medicare tax as well. So like if you've got a part-time job currently and you get your pay stub, however much you're working per hour and the number of hours that you worked, you don't actually take home that amount of money. They take out income tax, they take out money for Social Security, and they take out money for Medicare. What happens in Puerto Rico is they take out 2 of the 3. They do not take out income tax. They are able to come into the United States from Puerto Rico with no passport. Okay, so again, that's the territorial status. So they have their own local legislature. Now they have their own locally elected governor. It's no longer appointed by the government of the United States. But unlike a state, they do not have a vote in Congress. They have non-voting members that can go and participate in debates. They can participate in committee meetings when they're reviewing bills before it comes out to the full legislature, but they do not get a vote in the proceedings that go before the United States Congress. They also do not have electoral votes. There are no electoral votes in any of the territories because they're not states. They do participate in federal elections, like for president, in the primaries. So Puerto Rico and Guam and American Samoa and the Mariana Islands, they are able to vote in the primary where each party is choosing their candidate. But then the general election in November, they're not allowed to vote in, okay? So there have been, actually I need to change this up. There have now been 6 referendums on whether or not to become a state. The most recent was actually this past November in 2020. So I need to change that from last year. So there have been 6 referendums, the most recent being in 2020, which I'm going to show you some results from that in just a second. But remember from the progressive era, what we said initiative and referendum were, isn't a referendum where the people themselves vote directly on an issue. So the referendum here is yes or no, should Puerto Rico become a state? Yes or no. The people of Puerto Rico voted on whether or not to become a state. So that's basically saying, should we submit an application to the United States Congress to become a state? Now, there are arguments to both sides of this. They've got some protections, they've got some benefits from not being a state, but they have some things that is a problem because they're not a state. So the referendum votes in these elections, these were the previous 5 where they had voted, but the other ones were just really messy. And you had all of these different options. They could become a commonwealth, which is slightly different than being or kind of staying like a territory. It's basically like being a territory in the way that they already were, becoming a state, becoming independent, but having a direct tie to the United States in case of threat from the outside or something like that, or true and full independence. So you can see here in this early period, there was very limited interest in becoming a state. But look how that has changed over time, okay? 97% wanted or voted to become a state in 2017. So those votes look very dramatic when we get to 2017, but there's something that you need to consider in that vote from 2017. Only 23% of the people of Puerto Rico participated in the vote. And of that 23%, 97% said, yes, we want to be a state. There was actually a boycott by one of the parties in Puerto Rico, and they didn't participate at all in the vote. So that's why those numbers are somewhat skewed. All right. So in November of 2020, there was another referendum vote, and here is the outcome. So we've got 52% who say yes, they want to become a state. Now up here in 2012, where it was more than 50%, you've got all of this confusion of these other options here. And so they kind of threw those results out and didn't follow them. They tried to make it simpler here in 2017, but you had the boycott by one party and a very, very limited turnout of voters. So they tried again in 2020, and you've got more than 50% saying, yes, they want to become a state. Some people pointed to the issues related to hurricane response. You'll remember a couple of years ago when the massive hurricane just absolutely devastated Puerto Rico. And there were, problems with getting support and supplies into the people of Puerto Rico. Some of the people in Puerto Rico were saying, if we had been a state, would we have been treated differently? The outcome here is more than 50%, and you have more than 50% of the voters that actually went and participated in this particular referendum. So it remains to be seen whether or not the application for statehood is going to come before the Congress and whether or not it would be accepted. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch here in the next year or so to see what happens with Puerto Rico potentially becoming our 51st state. So we will have to wait and see. All right, so back to Cuba. Cuba, you'll remember, was granted its independence with the end of the Spanish-American War, but the US was still kind of monitoring what was going on there. The military was still there. And by 1902, Cuba's like, you've got to go. You have got to go. We are an independent nation. We do not want to be controlled by the United States. And one of the conditions to that was the United States required that in their constitution, they add the Platt Amendment. So again, an amendment is an addition to. So the Platt Amendment is added in 1902. That is going to, and this was the agreement that the United States would leave. And so this is the Platt Amendment to that war declaration. And it's going to say that the rights of Cubans will be restricted. There will be no treaties signed between Cuba and another country without the approval of the United States. And Cuba must lease a naval base to the United States. And the United States can intervene anytime it's necessary to preserve order. Does this truly sound like Cuba is independent? Not so much. And so that's going to kind of start some of the bad blood between the United States and Cuba here, coming after the Spanish-American War. So this naval base that needs to be leased, this is also going to end up fulfilling another one of those recommendations of Alfred Thayer Mahan's book. So today, Guantanamo Bay is that naval base that we still are in possession of on Cuban soil. It is a maximum security facility. In recent years after 9/11, there have been some questions about terrorists that are held here. So this is a maximum security facility that a lot of people who are captured around the world as suspected terrorists are held. And then questions about interrogation techniques and what's permissible at Guantanamo Bay versus on a base in the United States. Is it the same? Is it not? So there are a number of questions related to that. We look at the position, Guantanamo Bay is probably one of the better ports in Cuba, but the United States still has control of it. And it's here on this southern coastline of Cuba. We control both sides, the mouth of the bay, so we control what goes in and out of this area. And again, it's a highly secure location. This will come up again when we get to the 1950s and 60s with the growing tension and the Bay of Pigs incident and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it will come up again. 1916, the Philippines are also going to be granted independence at some point in the future. It does not give a specific date at which the Philippines would be granted independence. And I want you to remember the timing of this, because when we get to the end of this particular chapter and we start talking about Woodrow Wilson's presidency and Woodrow Wilson's approach to foreign policies, Wilson is president in 1916, which is going to play into why the Philippines would be promised independence. But again, it's not going to be clear when that will happen, but it comes after World War II in 1946. And that's going to partially be because of the role that the Philippines and the United States will play in the Pacific part of the war in World War II. All right, so now let's move on to trade and how this is going to happen around the world and the influence and access that the United States will have to various locations for trade. So here in this cartoon, we've got, well, I hardly know which to take first. We've got William McKinley here, and we know that because his name's on, his name is on the towel. We've got the bill of fare. Basically, what are you planning to order? It's like he's in a restaurant, Cuban steak, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, the Sandwich Islands, and then Uncle Sam is saying, I just don't even know where to start first. Okay, with Asia, we've got the spheres of influence that the European nations have established. And what they've basically done, no one European country has colonized China. But what they have done is they've gone into China and they have divided it up into sections. And so here you've got all of the European powers represented, and they've divided up China into sections, and they're going to be called spheres of influence. And each European section is the place where that European country can come in and sell their products. And so they have a right to control trade within that sphere of China. Well, again, nobody asked China about this. And you've got all of these Europeans that are flooding in there. And the United States is worried that if they are carving up China, then are they going to block these particular areas from US goods coming in for trade? The Secretary of State, John Hay, is going to issue a statement that we call the open door policy, that he expects the United States to be treated fairly in trade, right? So he fires off this letter to all these European nations, and they read it and they're like, whatever, and they just kind of toss it aside and ignore what John Hay is saying, that we don't want a sphere of influence. We want to trade with every sphere. We don't want to be limited to one section. And so this is called the open door policy. The United States want free trade, not colonies. So again, you've got the idea of the Europeans trying to close off trade restrictions to certain sections of China. And the United States is saying, nope, we want free and open trade with all of these areas. All right, the people of China become angry over these European influences that are coming in. There are large numbers of missionaries, so it's more than just trade. You also have cultural influences that are coming into China that has been a very, very closed society for a long time. And the Boxer Rebellion breaks out. This is kind of a cultural war that goes on within China to try to force out these European influences. And there are numerous missionaries who are killed in the process of the Boxer Rebellion that takes place in 1900. So the official name of the Boxers was the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. And what they're trying to do is preserve traditional Chinese culture from outside influences. Okay, so again, the open door policy is going to be the main focus of our foreign affairs at this time. So again, we're not wanting to get involved in European wars. We're not wanting to get involved in European affairs, but we want to trade with everybody. And that's going to help us with our exports. And the US states that we have a right to intervene to keep markets open. So if we have to use our military, we will, to maintain open markets. And if we are closed off from areas, then that is going to be threatening our survival, our citizens, our prosperity, our ability to trade. And so these are going to be the foundations. And John Hay really outlined that for the United States in the open door policy. So Roosevelt comes in as president, and just like he does everything else in his life and in his career, his efforts in foreign policy are over the top. They are grand, they are expensive, and they're going to be quite flashy, as you can imagine. The Japanese and the Russians are going to be fighting over Manchuria, which is a region of China in kind of the eastern, northeastern part of China. And the Japanese want that to be their sphere of influence. Well, so do the Russians. So they start to fight a war over who controls Manchuria. And similarly to what Roosevelt did during the coal strike, he brings representatives from both sides to the White House, and he gets them to sit down and work out and creates a negotiated settlement that divides this up. Roosevelt ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in bringing about peace between Japan and Russia. So keep that in mind as well, that Roosevelt, who we will see becomes more aggressive as time goes on, wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the first American to do that with his role here in negotiating peace in Manchuria. So Japan is getting a little frustrated with the competition from the United States. And so there is a gentleman's agreement that is finally negotiated between Roosevelt and Japan that is going to, the whole issue with Chinese Exclusion Act. Japanese exclusion is also taking place in lack of access from Angel Island. And the agreement becomes that if Japan will limit the numbers of people coming to and immigrating to the United States, then the US will try to protect Japanese rights in San Francisco. Now, not a lot of that ends up being fulfilled. And the Root Takahira Agreement is also going to be looking at the open door policy, and that Japan agrees to it, and that the annexation of Manchuria and Korea is going to be respected by the United States. So this is kind of an agreement that both sides are getting a little bit of what they want. But things are still not totally resolved here. There's growing tension between the United States and Japan. So Roosevelt believes that the best way to protect American interest is to increase our Navy. So again, that goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan's recommendations that by having a strong Navy, you are protecting the United States and your nation. So he puts a ton of money into building the most modern and sophisticated naval fleet in the world. And it's going to be known as the Great White Fleet, because these are big, huge white battleships. And he wants to send them around the world to show them off. And it's going to be known as the Goodwill Cruise. And so the Great White Fleet, they go in a convoy, right? See one ship after the other. and they literally sail around the world, and they stop at various ports along the way, and they have these big, magnificent displays of American military power and might. The Goodwill Cruise, what is he actually doing there? Isn't he actually kind of showing off American military power as a way of issuing almost like a threat that you don't want to interfere with American interests, because this is what we now have at our disposal? So we can see that the American soldiers are parading through the streets of Australia here in 1908 as part of that Goodwill Cruise. So again, the Great White Fleet, make sure that you are familiar with that, because this is an example of the demonstration of the expansion of militarism on the side of the United States. The United States and Latin America, the Roosevelt Corollary is going to be part of this, where he is going to expand the Monroe Doctrine to where not only are we trying to prevent Europeans from having influence in the Mediterranean or in the Caribbean or in Latin American countries, the United States is now appointing itself basically as the police force, that we would be in charge of monitoring what's going on there. So here you can see Theodore Roosevelt. He refers to, or we refer to his foreign policy approach as big stick diplomacy, meaning that it comes from this old African proverb, speak softly but carry a big stick, which basically means that you don't have to go out and do all of these boisterous speeches and all of this, that if you've got a military backing you up and you've got weapons to back you up, then you don't need to go out and do any talking. And so here we've got Theodore Roosevelt parading his Great White Fleet throughout the Caribbean, throughout Latin America, which is doing the talking for the United States and preventing Europeans from getting involved in the region as well. So this is going to be his approach. It is very militaristic and very strong. One of the other things that he achieves is the Panama Canal, which he is desperate to build for his Great White Fleet. But Panama was a colony of Colombia, the country of Colombia at the time. And Roosevelt approaches Colombia and asks to buy a section of Panama to build the Panama Canal and from Colombia. And Colombia says no. And Roosevelt's like, what? You're telling the United States, no, we can't have access to this? So he thought about going in and taking it from Colombia, but then he thought better of that. And he decided, well, what if the Panamanians that aren't happy about being a colony of Colombia, what if they became an independent nation with the help of the United States? Then we could acquire the strip of land that we need from Panama, who would then be an independent nation. And that's exactly what happened. Panama became an independent country. The United States is backing them. They never actually go on the ground. They don't end up fighting against Colombia, but because our battleships are kind of parked along that coastline, the signal was sent to Colombia and Panama became independent. And the United States is going to acquire the land that it needs. So a 10-mile wide strip of land. We're going to pay Panama $10 million for that strip of land and $250,000 a year rent. And this amount of rent is nothing compared to the value that this canal brings to the United States. So what ended up happening is there's going to be the Gatun Lake, and there's going to be a dam that's built, and they're going to be digging out all of these different places, and then they blow up the dam and it floods the whole area and creates the waterway through Panama. And it is incredibly deep. So these are the locks. You know that a lock is where you can open and close the gates to change the elevation of the water. And so these are the locks, these really, really tall structures, and there's enormous amounts of land that have to be blasted out of the canal zone. So it's incredibly labor intensive. And the French had actually started construction on a canal of their own, and it had been abandoned because of the deaths to all the workers that were there. And one of the main culprits of it was disease. Malaria was uncontrolled. So the doctor who was part of the Panama Canal project is actually one of the main instrumental components to actually the US being successful in this effort. And again, this is all being driven by Theodore Roosevelt. He actually goes down to Panama, and there's a picture of him in this white suit, and he's driving a bulldozer and everything as part of the canal's construction. So when they build the canal, so the ships come in here, and then when you get to the other side, look at the change of elevation. So if you start here at A and you come through, you've got a dramatic change in elevation over the course of the route. And so these locks, the ship comes in between the two parts, and they can either drain it or flood it to move the ship in the direction that it needs to go. All right, here's what the canal looks like today. So here are the locks that we're talking about. The ships come in and they charge different rates to go through the Panama Canal depending on the type of ship. If it's a passenger ship, they're going to charge a whole lot of money to go through there. If it's a, an oil tanker or something like that. And the US had control of who had access to the canal for a long time. But notice how narrow this is, and this is going to be important for shipbuilding even today. Passenger ships, cruise ships can't be wider. Battleships, okay, the base of it can't be wider than would fit through the Panama Canal. Now, there have been discussions about whether or not to, do some updating to the Panama Canal and make it wider in certain sections. And I don't know that that has fully been resolved because the United States no longer has control of the canal. So the US controlled it from when it was completed. I think it took 8, 10, 12 years, something like that to complete construction of the canal. But by 1977, the United States is going to reach an agreement with Panama to turn over control of it to the Panamanians. So initially, the United States and Panama, the US was in complete control, but Panamanians, many of them worked in the Panama Canal Zone along with many Americans. But in 1977, Jimmy Carter, as part of this effort to improve relations and America's reputation in Latin America, negotiated a treaty with Panama that would over time turn over control of the canal to them. So by December the 31st, 1999, the Panama Canal was in complete possession of Panama. Now, again, this was a decision that Jimmy Carter caught a lot of heat for by many Americans, saying that this was such an important strategic asset for the United States that it was not a wise decision to turn that over. Okay, the Roosevelt Corollary. Corollary is like an addition to or an adjustment to. So it changes the Monroe Doctrine, where we had previously said that we expect Europe to stay out of Latin American affairs. The Roosevelt Corollary is saying now that the US is going to come into Latin America and monitor what's going on there, right? If there's something that takes place, if there's unrest that happens, the US will be responsible for that. So it's again taking the United States approach as kind of the leader here in the Western Hemisphere, which is exactly what had also happened in the Monroe Doctrine, but it just kind of updates it. All right, Taft, when he was president, we said that he had a totally different philosophy on trust busting and the environment from Roosevelt. He also has a different approach to foreign affairs, where Roosevelt's foreign policy was known as big stick diplomacy, which was expanding the military. Taft's approach to foreign affairs is going to be called dollar diplomacy. And he believes that US businesses could invest in companies and locate their companies in Latin America and have Latin American employees, and that influence, that economic influence, right? If the workers of Latin America were relying on American businesses for their livelihood, then that's going to do as much good to have American power in the region as the military. So we call this dollar diplomacy, that your investments, that if we open up banks in Latin America, if we have businesses that open, American businesses that open in Latin America, that financial control and financial influence in the region is going to make the United States powerful. So again, that's a different approach than we would have seen. When Wilson comes in, as we saw in 1912, he is an anti-imperialist. And I would be very clear on this, that Woodrow Wilson believes in moral diplomacy, that this idea of human rights and humanity and no colonization is his philosophy. So big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy still has US control and influence in these regions. Moral diplomacy is saying, no, we need to give these people in all of these areas of the world the tools to be independent and promote freedom around the world. So his Secretary of State is William Jennings Bryan. And we've also talked about William Jennings Bryan being part of the anti-imperialist. You know, there was this whole anti-imperialist league, this whole group of people, famous Americans who were opposed to US involvement in imperialism. So this again tells us that this idea of morality and moral diplomacy, it's all wrapped in together here with Woodrow Wilson. Okay, the Mexican Revolution, there is basically a lot of instability. So there's a lot of back and forth as to who's in power here in Mexico. And the person that we had supported was Carranza. And when he comes to power, there's going to be an effort to try to overthrow him as well. And that's going to cause problems where the US is trying to make sure that he stays in power. And that comes to the fact that Pancho Villa, he is kind of this rebel revolutionary who's going against the Mexican leader Carranza, who had come to power after all this instability. He's the one that Wilson supports, but Pancho Villa is trying to undo that. So Woodrow Wilson actually sends the military in to arrest and capture Pancho Villa, because Pancho Villa crossed over the Mexican border into the United States. I believe it was in New Mexico, and killed, you know, 2 dozen Americans. And so Wilson is going to go after him and capture him, chases him all over Mexico, and never does succeed in capturing him. General John Pershing, this is where he kind of gets his start. He's going to be the overall commander in World War I for the American forces. But before that, he is trying to track down Pancho Villa and his rebels in Mexico. So this is just kind of speaking to the instability of Mexico at this time and the growing tension between Mexico and the United States, which plays a role in our decision in World War I. And that's where we are now. The next part of our story is World War I. And this is another instance where the United States is going to look towards remaining neutral, but trading with everybody. And then over time, that becomes untenable, and we end up getting involved in the war for a number of reasons. All right, so World War I, we can look at these long-term causes to the war. Growing nationalism among all countries of Europe. These European countries, the United States, we know that there's just this growing effort to promote your country and your needs and your efforts. There's also new technology that is making the militaries of all of these countries more powerful than ever before. And there are alliances that come into play. And as people are joining alliances, they often are going to act in a way that may be somewhat more aggressive than they would normally act, because they know they have backup. If you're going to, you know, get into some sort of a conflict with somebody, you know, some sort of school fight or whatever, and it's you against a whole group of people, you're probably not going to be as aggressive. But if you're the one that has backup, you're probably going to be more aggressive, which is what ends up happening with the alliances. And then also imperialism, this competition for land and access and securing trading rights in certain areas, the competition and the rivalry with the colonies around the world, all of this is just adding to the constant tension between countries in Europe. This is kind of an overview of the various alliances. The two main alliances will be the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. We'll eventually call when we get to World War II, we're going to call these the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. But for now, the Triple Alliance would be the Central Powers: Italy, Germany, Austria, Hungary. They're kind of in the central part of Europe. And then the Triple Entente would be Great Britain, France, and Russia. And you can see that there are some secret alliances. There are formal treaties that take place. And then there are also areas where they've got kind of mutual aid or support for certain countries. So notice that Russia here is in this agreement with Serbia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. We've got some influences here in the Balkan region. The Balkans would be kind of in that area, kind of near Turkey and kind of between the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia. So here's the location. Again, we've got the Triple Alliance here in the center, and we've got the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia. And then the areas in question will be in this region here along the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, so with all of those elements in place, nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and the alliances, the trigger event that sparks all of this to erupt is the assassination of Francis Ferdinand. He is the son of the King of Austria-Hungary, and he has gone to Sarajevo and is going to, which is a colony of Austria-Hungary at the time, and he's there to try to represent the king and to try to get more support for his father's rule of the region. And there was a opposition, right? There's opposition to these empires controlling these regions in the Balkans. And one of the organizations, one of the resistance organizations was called the Black Hand. And it was a secret organization, and they had plotted to kill Francis Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. There they are in the car not too long before they get assassinated. And this guy, he's a young guy, Gavrilo Princip, he's a teenager who's part of this Black Hand organization and is really a low-level guy. He was not the one really supposed to be carrying this assassination out, but as circumstances have it, he ends up in the middle of it. So they're in Sarajevo and they're going to give a speech, and they're driving down the road, and there's a pipe bomb that explodes in the motorcade a little bit ahead of them, and it becomes clear that they're under attack. And so they kind of turn the car around, and they're trying to get through the streets of Sarajevo, and they end up going the wrong way down a one-way street. And when the pipe bomb exploded and it hit the wrong car, the members of the Black Hand organization, they kind of scatter and try to blend in with the crowd and with people of Sarajevo. And so Gavrilo Princip was actually kind of like at this cafe or whatever, and all of a sudden he sees the Duke's car come down the street, and it's backing up and turn around trying to get back down the other street. And so he takes that opportunity as it presented itself, and he walks up to the car and he shoots and kills Sophie and Francis Ferdinand. So now the son of the Austria-Hungarian king has been murdered, and he wants someone held accountable. And so this causes an entire chain reaction of events. So the Serbians refuse to turn over or to help in the investigation, and so that is going to anger all of these groups. And Germany, if we go back, we go back, Germany is in an alliance with Austria-Hungary. And so when they are not getting the answers that they want from Serbia, then Austria-Hungary is going to declare war on Serbia. And so as a result, Russia, who's in an alliance with Serbia, declares war on support Serbia. And so Germany, to support Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia. And then France, who's in an alliance with Russia, declares war on Germany. And then Germany blasts through Belgium, that's neutral in all of this. And as a result, Great Britain declares war on Germany. And all of this happens like in a week. So you've got the entire continent of Europe erupting in war with far more deadly military equipment than ever before. And they're now at war with one another. So the United States, again, is neutral. The United States is wanting to stay out of this. And they are going to try to trade with all of the sides, but not get involved in the war. So the name, I mean, we call it World War I, but they wouldn't have called it World War I at the time because they didn't know there was going to be a World War II. So it was referred to as the Great War because it was encompassing all of these different countries, European countries, and all of these European countries have colonies around the world. So there was fighting all over the world. in this great war. And you've got the advanced weapons, we've got the machine guns. And then one of the other important features of World War I is trench warfare. There is an elaborate network of trenches that will cross through, the European continent that really holds off both sides because it's a defensive measure. If you've got people down here in these trenches that have these guns and the enemy's coming at you across the land, you just pop up and then you blow them up. You've got barbed wire that's preventing them from getting access to the trenches. And they get more and more elaborate, right? You've got these bunkers inside, you've got this wood flooring so that when it rains, the water drains through. And I want you to notice the soldiers in their uniforms. They've got these leg wrappings because they didn't want the rodents and everything in the trenches to go up the pants leg. They also, it's going to keep the water out a little bit better so that their feet stay dry and they stay healthy. So this is kind of the structure that we're talking about with the trenches. So the dugout down here, if they're being bombed or shelled, they can hide out in this area. You've got the sandbags, you've got your platform, and then the barbed wire, and then your enemy has the very same thing on the other side, and in between is what we call no man's land. Because if you come out of your trench and you try to offensively attack your enemy in no man's land, that's where you're going to get killed. Okay. So this is elaborate. It was scary because they do have bombs here and artillery that can launch over and the bombs can hit as craters within the trenches. You would want to make your trench far enough away from your enemy's trench so that the bombs really, or the bombs or the grenades that they're throwing can't reach you. So it was nerve-wracking. If you're on this front line of the trench, you're certainly not going to sleep. So they would rotate troops out, in and out, and you would have this as the front line. And then every, 12 to 24 hours, you would move back here to the reserve trench that is out of range of any sort of access from the enemy. And you would bring in the fresh troops that had previously been sleeping. And then notice again, they've dug out these little areas that they can get closer and they can kind of listen in to figure out if the enemy is approaching. So World War I is going to last for a number of years, and it is more deadly than our previous wars. And that's because of the new technology. We've got better weapons than ever before, but we've also got a stalemate. Nobody's gaining any sort of an advantage. Nobody's taking land from anybody else because of the trenches. So they're kind of stuck in this just constant, blasting one another. It's also going to have more casualties than ever before. Look at these numbers. Now, the United States gets into the war at the very end. So for a number of years prior to the US entry into the war, the Europeans have been fighting. And notice the numbers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and we're talking casualties. So casualty is not necessarily a death. It is death plus wounded. You're wounded and you're dead would be included in your casualties. But still, if you've got casualties, then that means that they're probably not able to fight and they're probably going to have long-term issues, whether they've lost arms or legs or whatever. So we've got over 14 million casualties by Germany and Austria-Hungary, 9 million for Russia, 6 million for France, 3 million, 2 million, and then the United States coming in because we, again, come in at the end of the war, 364,000. So when that war is all over with and we've got these staggering numbers, I want you to think about the idea of repairing the nation. You're going to have a hard time doing that because of this loss in the population and that it was so very, very difficult. So Woodrow Wilson is president at the time, and we know that his philosophy to foreign affairs is moral diplomacy. He does not want to get involved in the war. So he is going to say that we have got to stay neutral. And this is a very famous quote from him that I would be familiar with. So this is during the European part of the war prior to the United States getting involved. And look what he says. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name. Meaning we truly cannot get involved. We can't just say that we're neutral, but we actually have to act as a neutral. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. A nation that neither sits in judgment upon others, nor is disturbed in her own counsels, and which keeps herself fit and free to do what is honest and disinterested and truly serviceable for the peace of the world. When he's saying we have to be neutral in thought as well as in action, this is really going to be hard to do, because think about the large numbers of immigrants that we have in the United States. They're going to have family members, they're going to have friends, they're going to have memories of their home that's going to make them naturally side with one group or the other. And that's going to be a tall order. But Wilson is trying to acknowledge, I know this is going to be difficult, but the US has got to stay neutral. So many Americans are going to fit into one of three categories. They're either going to be isolationists, meaning we've got to stay out of this. This is their problem. We are totally out. We will have people who are interventionists. These are largely people who see that the US is needing to step in on one side or the other for whatever the reason. Maybe it's, again, the cultural connection that immigrants may have, or for some other reason. And then there's a third group, the group that would be the internationalists, which believe that the United States should not get involved militarily, but that the United States should get involved as a negotiator to reestablish peace in the world. All right, so this guy being depicted here would be an isolationist because he's just kind of ignoring what's going on. All right, so Wilson is an internationalist. He absolutely wants peace in the world. He does not want the US military to get involved, but he believes that the United States needs to take a leadership role diplomatically in the world. If we can help to negotiate peace here, that launches the United States status in world affairs. And so he is absolutely an internationalist. I would make sure again that I'm clear on that. He is not an interventionist. He does not want to get involved militarily because he again believes in moral diplomacy, but he's an internationalist who believes that the US should take a leadership role in negotiating peace and a peace treaty among all of these various sides. And that's going to be difficult to do because through all of this, we are also expecting to be able to trade with everybody. And that becomes difficult as the British are going to use their incredibly powerful Navy to stop any sort of shipments from coming in from the outside to Germany through their blockade. And this becomes an issue of contraband versus non-contraband items. According to international law, non-contraband items, meaning items that are not part or necessary for the military effort, are allowed to be traded across enemy lines. Contraband items, which would be like munitions, things that you would be using for the military, those items are subject to confiscation by, another force that's going to try to prevent them from being delivered. So the United States is saying that we're involved in non-contraband trade with these other countries, and that's going to get messy. The Germans are also suspicious that the United States is trading with Great Britain, and the Germans just start sinking all of the British ships in the North Atlantic. And a passenger ship gets caught up in the middle of this, the Lusitania, which is this big, beautiful passenger liner that is like a big cruise ship. And the German U-boats, which is, again, a new technology, this is brand new in World War I, they're submarines, underwater boats or undersea boats, are going to torpedo and sink the Lusitania. And they also have sunk the Sussex. And when word comes out, there are some really powerful people and important people on the Lusitania when it sinks. And this is potentially could bring in the United States in the war because there are Americans that were on the ship. And but again, Wilson thinks this is not the right thing to do, but Germany is concerned they don't want the United States to come in on the side of the British. So they issue what's called the Sussex Pledge, which says, we're sorry, we won't sink any more passenger ships. They claimed that there were actually munitions being snuck across the Atlantic on the passenger boat. And when they sank it, and it turned out that they were actually right. So later on, that was proven to be true, but at the time, nobody knew that. So what is the US response? to the sinking of the Lusitania. And I would pay very close attention to this. We do not declare war. We do not declare war. We do not declare war at the sinking of the Lusitania. Instead, we're going to again reiterate that we expect to have free and open trade with everybody, but we do not yet declare war. This is a common mistake among students. They tell me all the time that the cause of US entry into the World War I is the sinking of the Lusitania. I think what the sinking of the Lusitania does is it solidifies who the enemy is, and more Americans become opposed to the German side of the war, but it is not prompting immediate entry into the war. Okay, so this is what we mean by the U-boats, okay, and the submarines that are going to be used. So here was Wilson's response. There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There's such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right. So again, he's trying to use this diplomacy, this internationalist approach to try to resolve the issue rather than using the military effort. So election of 1916 rolls around. Woodrow Wilson is going to be elected, and he is saying, you know, I've kept us out of the war and you should reelect me because we've remained prosperous. We're trading with everybody and we've stayed out of this European war. And he does win pretty convincingly over Charles Evans Hughes, who's a Supreme Court judge who was a Republican. By 1917, there are two other events that will push the US into the military conflict. All right, so this is what brings the US into the war. The Zimmermann Note, which is a communication that Germany was sending to Mexico that was intercepted and turned over to the United States and published in the newspapers. And it was telling Mexico that if you join us in an alliance, and basically if you pick a fight with the United States, then the United States is going to be occupied with their military in North America and not entering in the war in Europe. And in return, once the war is over with and Germany wins, then they were promising to give back to Mexico the Mexican cession. So all of that territory that had been lost in the Mexican-American War, Germany is promising to return to Mexico in return for joining them in an alliance. Now, this was intercepted and published in the newspapers. And this, when they're plotting against the United States, that's going to turn the tide, and Wilson will at that point declare war. And also Germany breaks the Sussex Pledge and they resume submarine warfare where they start going after our merchant ships in the Atlantic. So those two events will push us into the war declaration, which he gets. There is a little bit of opposition, but notice that this is in April of 1917. So the United States is going to go to war. And our commander in the war is going to be John Pershing. So look at his war declaration. And this is going to indicate, kind of foreshadow what Wilson's vision for the world will be afterwards and what he believes is the goal. The goal in this war, again, is to not acquire territory. But look what he says the goal is. The world must be made safe for democracy. And I would certainly write this down. So this is the war declaration speech that Wilson gives to Congress. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest and no dominion, meaning we're not going to take colonies. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedoms of nations can make them. So again, this is making, as he's saying, the world safe for democracy, which in turn would allow free and open trade with everybody. All right. So the American soldiers do indeed go to war. And there was there's a song that is very connected to the US effort in World War I, and it's called Over There. So Over There is talking about Europe. right? It's seen as this far off place. Have we sent American soldiers to fight in a war around the world recently? I mean, the Philippines would have been the only time, but it was not on as large of a scale as this war is. And so this was something different from previous American conflicts. So I want to play you this song and show you some footage from World War I. But look at the words, because I've seen these lyrics from the song used before in multiple choice questions, and then also in SAQs. All right, so listen to this song, and the tune of it, you're going to start hearing it in your head constantly.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly. Yankee doodle do or die. Pack your little kit, show your grit, do your bit. Yankees to the ranks, from the towns and the tanks. Make your mother proud of you, and the old red, white, and blue. Over there.
All right, so I think you get the picture. So this is again talking about how important it is to protect the United States, and that this is something to be proud of, to volunteer, to sign up for the military and go and fight. And there was indeed a draft. So when they're talking about reporting, you're reporting for duty. So the Selective Service Act is the draft for World War I, and every man within a certain age range would register with the draft, and then they would draw the numbers out, and if you had that number, then you were supposed to report. Now, they're not going to draw 500,000 numbers. There might be, a couple of thousand people with the same number, so it would be that group that was supposed to report. And there was a great effort for trying to promote the goals of the war and the operation of the war. So we're not really, in our purposes here in U.S. history, we're not going to be going through all of the fighting battles in World War II. We're looking at the U.S. role in the war. So the draft was controversial. You had people who were conscientious objectors saying that they were pacifist, maybe they were Quakers, and they were saying that it was against their religion to fight in a war because of their pacifism and because of their Quaker beliefs. And did the government have a right to force you to do that? And so there were some questions about the legality of the draft. All right, there were a number of agencies that were responsible for the incredible promotion of US support to our allies in World War I, because of course we are going to support Great Britain and France in these efforts. And so Bernard Baruch is responsible for the War Industries Board. And they took all of these factories in the United States that had previously been producing consumer products, and they transitioned, and now they're producing war materials. They're going to be producing tanks. Tanks were new in World War I. They're going to be producing machine guns and equipment and bullets and all of these things that everyone's going to need in the war, all of our troops and then also our allies' troops. Then the Food Administration is going to be led by Herbert Hoover. And this is where he also gets a lot of fame and recognition nationwide, is for his success in the Food Administration, because not only are we feeding all Americans with the farm products, but we're also feeding all of our allies. So Hoover is really encouraging these farmers to expand their crops and their production, because we're feeding everybody. And he's also suggesting that the food that civilians who are back home in America are eating, that you shouldn't waste it. That if you go and you have a plate of food and you don't eat it all, well, then that could have gone to feed a soldier. And so there were campaigns to try to limit the amount of food that people were eating in the United States. And they would have things like Wheatless Wednesdays, where nobody in America would eat anything that contained wheat on Wednesdays. And so you're saving that much of the wheat harvest that could go and then feed the soldiers, or Meatless Mondays, or, you know, something like that. They would put those campaigns together. Look at these war posters where it's got our flags. Beat Germany, support every flag that opposes Prussianism, eat less of the food fighters need, deny yourself something, waste nothing. And that's compliments of the US Food Administration, just reminding everybody to do their part. Food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. Wheat is needed for the allies, waste nothing. So who would be the audience for this particular war poster? Okay, if we're thinking about historical situation, audience, purpose, and point of view, historical situation clearly is US entry into World War I. But the audience, you came here seeking freedom. So isn't this talking about the immigrant class that have come here, maybe taken advantage of the homestead opportunities and the farming in the West? And so the purpose is to get them to produce more food and conserve what they've got. All of these fantastic posters are produced by the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, and George Creel. And they also are going to produce newsreels. So remember, motion pictures were new at the time with Thomas Edison, and they would put together before a movie, they would have people who were part of the Committee on Public Information that would come and speak, you know, like 2 or 3 minutes before the movie feature would start, and give updates on the war and that kind of thing. And their job was to make sure that the American people understood who the enemy was, why the United States was fighting, and what our goals were. So look at this cartoon, or this poster, Destroy the Mad Brute. And he's got on this Prussian helmet from the military. And we've got Lady Liberty here, who's being kidnapped from America. And so he's got blood on here with his culture. And so, you know, the only way to fight against this is to enlist in the army. All right, we've got to pay for the war. We're going to do that a couple of ways. Woodrow Wilson is going to be very instrumental in getting the money that's needed. And they do that through raising taxes and also through selling more bonds. And they're going to call them Liberty bonds. And you would basically, if you had savings, you would buy a Liberty bond, which gives the United States government the cash right now that it needs to fight the war. And then in some future time, you cash in your bond and you get interest. So again, look at these great posters. Help crush the menace of the seas, buy Liberty bonds, buy quickly, buy freely. So why do we have this bloody hand coming out of the water? What's that representing? So that would be the submarines, right? That are coming out of the water and they're destroying American lives. And then we've got these battleships that are being constructed. All right, in the mix of this, in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out. And so they've got kind of their own civil war that's going on in Russia that was an ally of Great Britain and France. So it was Great Britain, France, and Russia that were all on one side. And now the United States is coming into the war as well. And the war was being fought on two fronts. You had Germany fighting France in the West, and you had Germany fighting Russia in the East, and you had Great Britain that was in there also fighting in the West. And the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out in Russia, and the Tsar is going to be overthrown. This is when Nicholas and Alexandra are taken and executed, and it's the Vladimir Lenin comes to power with the leading the Bolsheviks. And so once he comes to power, we know that his authority is kind of unstable. So the last thing that he needs to be doing, if you're Vladimir Lenin, is continuing to fight against Germany when you're trying to maintain your own power in Russia. So Vladimir Lenin signs a treaty ending their role in the war with Germany. And that's going to be the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So I would make sure I'm clear on this, that this is the agreement, this is the end of the war between Russia and Germany. And so what that allows Germany to do, instead of splitting its army between the Western Front and the Eastern Front, it can now bring the Eastern soldiers in Germany to the West to supplement what's happening there. And so this was very dangerous for the French. They were worried that they couldn't hold on. So Vladimir Lenin is now in power in Russia, and he's kind of growing that Marxist idea of communism that is starting to grow there. At the same time that that's happening, right? So that's March of 1918. May of 1918 is when the United States takes control of the fighting in the Western Front, and that's going to be led by John Pershing. So we had Americans who were there later in 1917, but had not taken control of the actual fighting. So the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, which is the American forces that are now going to operate and command the British and the French and the American forces in Western Europe, are going to take over in May of 1918. And this really turns the tide. We've got fresh equipment, we've got fresh soldiers, we've added to what's being done on the Western Front, and that turns the tide of the war. So our American soldiers who were fighting there would have been known as the Doughboys, and they have a couple of distinctive features to their uniforms. We've already mentioned the leg wrappings that were there, but also kind of these bowl hats where you've got the bowl and then the flat brim, because this was, again, and they were metal. This was used in those trenches to try to provide support from the shelling that was coming out above. Domestically within the United States, there is a lot of fear of outside intervention and spying by the Russians and the communists, and the growing suspicions of all of that. And so there are two laws that are passed, the Espionage Act and another Sedition Act. And so this is about spying, and it is, here's another Committee on Public Information document that's warning people that spies were living in and among Americans, and that it was dangerous, and you had to be aware that there could potentially be danger in all of this. And so it lays out penalties for not being loyal to the United States. And then the Sedition Act that comes on the heels of that is also going to be very clear that anybody who is not on board with the war effort, who speaks out against the war, who is challenging the decisions of the war, or is potentially a spy, they are going to be arrested. All right. So that begs the question about protesting. Can you protest this war or can you not? And Eugene Debs, we know that he was the American Railway Union leader who turned socialist during the Pullman strike. Here he is again, and he was opposed to the war, saying that the war was actually being promoted by these businessmen who stood to profit money from the war. And so when he speaks out about this, he gets arrested on charges of violating the Sedition Act. So here's again the question. If we are making it illegal to speak out against government actions and restricting any sort of protest, does that restrict and violate the idea of free speech and free press? And so these questions are mounting. And these laws, it's very similar when we saw John Adams do this with the Alien and Sedition Acts way back in the 1700s. Here, the issue is coming up again. So we'll look at the court case that deals with this in just a minute. Also, domestically within the United States, there are huge needs for workers in the factories, even though we've got hundreds of thousands of men that have now gone to Europe to fight. And what we see is a shift in the population of African Americans from the South to urban areas of the North to take those job opportunities that are now available. So we call this the Great Migration. This is another huge result of World War I, is the shift in the Black population in record numbers to the urban areas of the North taking those jobs. These are three cities in particular that the Great Migration is going to draw support to: Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. And you can see in this artwork where African Americans are going through the doors, going into those new areas. So there are African Americans who do fight in World War I. They're in segregated units, but there is, again, discrimination at home. So if you think about the goals that Woodrow Wilson has set out of making the world safe for democracy, but is there true democracy in the United States? And those are going to be some of the areas of discussion that African Americans and others will use to try to say that this is not appropriate for the United States. So here again, we can see the movements of people. If we look at the numbers here in the graph, changes in the percent of the population, African Americans from 1910 to 1920. So this would be during the period of the Great Migration. So if the change is greater than 70%, then it's going to be pink. If we've got zero change or less than 10% of the population, then it's going to be green. So we can see these centers. Look at Chicago, look at Cleveland, Detroit. These are all very urban areas that are gaining larger percents in the population. Here, New York, Philadelphia. And then we can see that there are changes where they're not increasing numbers in these areas, they're actually losing numbers. And so that if it's below zero, then they're losing that percentage of the population. Isn't this also the area that we talked about with the concentration of African Americans going all the way back to the antebellum period? So we're seeing that shift out of the Deep South. Okay, women are also going to be instrumental in the war effort. They are going to serve in branches of the military, the Army Nursing Corps. They're going to be serving in, not in combat, but supplementing as secretaries and other, they're going to drive trucks. They're going to be here working on train cars that will help the war effort. And so they're trying to use this again as leverage to try to gain the right to vote, because they still didn't have the right to vote. Eventually, 1918, Germany is going to surrender to the Allies. So we talked about that when the United States arrived and took full control. US arrives in late 1917, takes full control of the AEF in early 1918, and then the surrender happens in November. And it happens here on this particular train car where the Germans surrender to the Allies. They sign an armistice. An armistice is basically a ceasefire. They've not negotiated any of the terms of the treaty, but they're agreeing to halt the fighting on November the 11th, 1918. Okay, women throughout all of this have been trying to still demand the right to vote. This National American Women's Suffrage Association, we had mentioned this back, I want to say maybe chapters 15 or 16, somewhere along the way. And I said, save the women's movement to later, because I think it fits better here. So this organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, began during this Reconstruction period, or the late Reconstruction, early Gilded Age period. And at the time of World War I, it was being led by Carrie Catt. It had started with the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s, but then it had kind of morphed after the Civil War. And so at this point, Carrie Catt is the leader. It's no longer Elizabeth Cady Stanton. and Lucretia Mott. Carrie Catt is now the main one who is in charge, and Susan B. Anthony is also part of NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And they are very supportive of the war effort and believe that women working in the war effort and being devoted to the cause of war will help them gain the right to vote. And so they continue their very traditional efforts to try to gain the right to vote by using their influence with politicians to try to get states to pass allowances for women to vote at the state level, and then continuing to try to push through the United States Congress. Another woman, a younger generation, kind of breaks off from NAWSA and form the National Women's Party, and that's going to be Alice Paul. And she and the other members of the National Women's Party are waiting for equality for women. They are opposed to the war effort, and they want to demand immediate equality, and they're going to use much more aggressive actions to do that by protest marches, going on a hunger strike. They get themselves arrested for picketing in front of Washington's, the White House. So here they are, they're in front of the White House. Woodrow Wilson's the president. Look what it says. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Isn't that what they're fighting for in Europe? What will you do for women's suffrage? And so notice what they say here, Kaiser Wilson. This is another image that's used a lot with multiple choice questions. Kaiser is the name for the German leader. So Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million women, American women, are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. So they're saying, this is hypocritical that you're saying that the Germans are not, you're trying to promote equality for Germans, but you've got all of these women here in America who do not have the right to vote. And so finally in 1918, later in 1918, the amendment is introduced. It's voted on in 1919. And ratified in 1920. So after the war ends in November of 1918, in 1919 is when Woodrow Wilson approves of the 19th Amendment, and it is ratified and by the states and goes into effect in 1920. So these are the suffragettes, they have won. So the question becomes, well, was it the National American Woman Suffrage Association that, brought about this victory, or was it the National Women's Party and their more aggressive tactics? Most historians today say that it was actually the combination of the two together that launched American support for gaining the right to vote for women. All right, so here is the impact of the war. You've got all of these soldiers who are actually dead across Europe. 5 million soldiers are dead. 8 million central powered soldiers are dead. 6.5 million civilians are dead. So these are staggering losses that are going to be hard to overcome. Again, we've also got the new technology in fighting the war. We've got more economic opportunity, as we saw with the Great Migration with African Americans, and we've also got women's participation that ultimately resulted in the right to vote. If things could get worse, at the end of the war, the flu pandemic of 1980 breaks out, which is kind of timely since we're currently in a pandemic. This was the last pandemic that we had. And, could the international nature of the war have helped to spread this flu virus? Sure. But 1/3 of the world's population ended up being infected, and over 50 million people died of the flu in 1918. So if you were lucky enough to have survived World War I, then you've got the flu pandemic on top of that. It was incredibly difficult times coming out of World War I to try to recover from the physical losses of the war, and then now the pandemic. All right. So again, the other big issue that I mentioned was the Supreme Court case or the Supreme Court rulings on the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts. And this is the case Schenck versus the United States. We're going to be reading this case in class because it is so pivotal and is still used today as part of the argument for some of the some of the actions or powers that the federal government will have. So when they challenged the constitutionality of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, the Supreme Court said, yes, these laws are acceptable. That's what upheld means. Upheld means, or uphold means to support the constitutionality of these two laws. And here's why. They say that a person's rights are not indefinite, and that there are times and situations where your rights may be restricted. And they say, and here's the phrase that comes out of Schenck that you need to be very familiar with, that when there is a clear and present danger by your words or actions, then the government may have the right to restrict your individual rights for the security and safety of everybody else. For example, in a normal school year, at class change, the up there at the top of the stairs there between the English hall and the social studies hall, that at the top of the stairs, it's just like this wad of people. What if someone thought it would be funny to yell that, someone had a gun or that there was some sort of danger right then, and it caused a panic and people fell down the stairs and got injured? That person's words, right? And they knew that there wasn't a gun. Now, it's a different story if they thought there really was one, but if they were doing that to be malicious, if their words are used to incite this panic, then other people's safety is being endangered by their words. And Schenck is saying, the Schenck case is saying, you're not allowed to do that. Your right to free speech does not surpass someone else's right to safety and national security. Okay. So in an instance of when there is a clear and present danger by your words or actions, then your rights can be restricted. Now, what do we mean by clear and present danger? So again, that's kind of vague. My definition of what's dangerous and what your definition of what's dangerous could be different. So let's finish up now. The war is over. We want to look at the Treaty of Versailles. That is going to be the negotiated end to World War I. So the armistice, which was the end of the fighting, was in November of 1918. And now the leaders of the main countries involved are going to go to Versailles, which is right outside of Paris, to negotiate the treaty. And Wilson, again, he's coming at this from his moral diplomacy approach, is going to support what he calls peace among equals. So he doesn't want to cast blame on one side or the other, because he says when you're blaming someone for this war and you try to punish them for the war, then they're not going to accept the terms, and that you've got underlying tension that could crop up again. Okay, so what he's trying to do, look at this cartoon. Can he produce harmony? And you've got World Peace Symphony, all of the nations, and you've got all of these countries over here. And can he actually bring them together in this idea of peace among equals? And he implemented, or in his State of the Union address, when the US entered the war in 1918, he actually laid out his plan for what he envisioned the post-war world to look at. And that's what, with the 14 points, you need to be very, very clear on. So there are 14 separate provisions that he establishes as a goal for the end of the war, which now would be what they're negotiating at Versailles. So he wants open covenants of peace, meaning that everyone is going to be peaceful. There's not going to be anyone blamed or charged with wrongdoing or anything like that. Absolute freedom of the seas for everybody. So free sea, no one country can control who's traveling through a body of water. Freedom of the seas, everyone has access. Those German U-boats, you can't stop anybody. All of that's got to be protected. Removal of all economic barriers. Doesn't that go back to the open door policy of John Hay? Yes. Adequate guarantees of disarmament. So he's believing that the militarism, the escalation of military weapons, is what kind of fueled some of this aggressive action. And if we scale back the numbers of weapons and the types of weapons that we have, it's going to make the world a safer place. Equitable colonial self-determination. What does that mean? All right, equitable means fair. Colonial, talking about colonies. Self-determination means that they govern themselves. So we're saying that all colonies will have self-determination, basically no more colonies, okay? Then 6 through 13, he's going to actually talk about specific boundaries of countries and who gets what. And then the last one is probably the key here, where he wants a general association of nations, which is going to be the League of Nations. And he believes that if all the countries of the world in a general association called the League of Nations had membership, when there was a conflict such as the assassination of Francis Ferdinand and the lack of cooperation by Serbia, then in resolving who's to be held accountable for that, then that conflict, rather than erupting in war, the conflict would be taken to the League of Nations, where this body of all of the countries of the world would resolve it together in a peaceful diplomatic manner. All right, so these are very idealistic terms, but this is what Wilson wants to achieve. So he arrives, he's going to represent the United States himself. Instead of sending his Secretary of State, instead of sending to represent the US in the negotiations, and instead of sending the head, he's like the leading expert in foreign policy in the US, was actually a Republican, and his name was Henry Cabot Lodge, and Wilson hated him. So he didn't even take Henry Cabot Lodge with him to the conference. Wilson goes himself, okay? And these are the main 4 people negotiating the treaty at Versailles, and it's gonna last for 6 months, all of this negotiation back and forth. Wilson, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, George Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Now, wait a minute. I thought Italy was on the side of the Central Powers. Well, they switched. During the course of the war, Italy became part of the Allies, so they will come here to Versailles as these the Allied powers, okay, that are going to negotiate the end of the war. So who's not part of this negotiation? Well, I don't see Germany. I don't see Austria-Hungary, and I don't see Russia. So those are some big ones that are not in attendance in this conference. And then again, the Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, is not there. Now, if we think ahead, the president doesn't have the authority to sign a treaty with another country on his own. That has to be ratified by the Senate. So by not including Henry Cabot Lodge, the head of this Senate committee that would be responsible for pushing through the treaty, that was a huge political mistake on Wilson's part, because he's going to be bitter about not being involved in the negotiations. Great Britain shows up with totally different goals than what Woodrow Wilson had. They want peace, sure, but they also want victory. They want Germany punished. Think about the millions of lives that they lost. Think about the money that has been invested. Think about the destruction that has been caused. They absolutely want peace with victory. They don't want to have no one wins. It's sort of like, you know, when you're a little kid and you were playing soccer. My nieces played soccer when they were itty bitties, and nobody kept score. Well, in their head, my nieces knew exactly what the score was, right? So when you have no score, it was supposed to be about the, you know, playing the game. Peace without victory, which Wilson wants, is about everyone coming together as a united global community. That's not what Great Britain's in agreement to. They want victory. They want Germany punished. And they also want to protect their colonies. Think about the vast empire that Great Britain has. So they're not on board with giving independence to their colonies. And they want Germany to pay, literally, for their role in the war. France has kind of the same goals. Okay, they want peace and victory. They want Germany punished, and they want reparations. They actually want cash money for what has been lost here, and they also want this region returned to them. And this is going to play a role in the startup of World War II. So the Alsace-Lorraine is a very resource-heavy region between France and the boundary with Germany. And it had been taken by Germany, and now France wants it back because this is more of a French-speaking region, but it's got a lot of resources that Germany wants for its industrial efforts. So that's going to be their goals. And so Wilson gets there and they're not interested in listening to his 14 points. So he ends up not getting freedom of the seas as part of the Treaty of Versailles. He does not get free trade agreements. He does not get liberation of the colonies, and he does not get a de-escalation of militarism. Can you imagine telling Great Britain and France, you need to scale back some of your weapons. You shouldn't stockpile those. What if they just come out of? Of course, they're not going to agree to this. So Wilson has to kind of back off of these ideas because these other countries, these other allied powers are saying, we lost so much more than the United States. You can't expect us to not agree to this. What Wilson refuses to back down on is the League of Nations. He says for the future peace of the world, this has to be included. And so the League of Nations is part of the Treaty of Versailles. And the treaty gets signed eventually. And it's also going to have a war guilt clause where part of the Treaty of Versailles specifically calls out Germany as responsible for all of World War I. Now, that's kind of a stretch because I think if we look at all of those factors that weighed in, there's a lot of responsibility to go around. Certainly Germany was primary in the devastation of the war, but being solely responsible for the amount of cash, the reparations that are going to have to be paid, that's going to anger Germany dramatically, especially since they weren't part of this negotiation. Okay, we've got new countries that are going to be created out of the Treaty of Versailles. So they take part of this area that used to be Russia, because remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, so there where Russia stops after the Bolshevik Revolution. These new countries are going to be created out of some of those previously Russian territories. And then we've got the Soviet Union that's been created by Vladimir Lenin. And we've got the Alsace-Lorraine that goes back to France. And so, and then we've got Austria-Hungary, which was one big empire that's now been carved up into these other new little places. So this territory is all lost by Russia. Everything in green is lost by Austria-Hungary, and it's split into new countries and new boundaries are set. Now, did anybody ask the people living in these places whether they wanted to be part of these new countries that are being created by a group of men drawing boundaries on maps? And that's going to be part of the problem as well. Okay, so the peace treaty did cause some problems. Germany with the war guilt clause is angry and wants redemption. The Vladimir Lenin, his government, and the Soviet Union is resentful that they've been left out and that this territory has been carved out, and the colonies don't get what they want. So also some of these new areas where the Ottoman Empire was also carved up as a result of this are going to create some boundaries for new nations that again are putting groups of people together that are culturally somewhat different. And that fuels a lot of these ethnic problems in some of these regions that we, quite frankly, still have some conflicts that have yet to be resolved in different areas of the world. Okay, so treaty comes back to the United States. It's presented to Congress, and there are some people with some big concerns about some of the policies in the treaty, especially even some of the Democrats are opposed to what Wilson has come up with. So the treaty comes back, it goes to the committee, and there are people who say, in no way are we going to accept the terms of this treaty. These are irreconcilables. These are people who say that the League of Nations is going to bind the United States into a foreign alliance. Now, go all the way back to George Washington and his farewell address. Didn't he warn the United States not to tie itself to a binding alliance with another country because it could force the United States to go to war and send American soldiers into a conflict that is about an issue that has no relevance to the United States whatsoever, okay? So that's what these irreconcilables, right? If something is irreconcilable, you can't resolve it. These people are opposed to the treaty. If the League of Nations is in this treaty in any way, shape, or form, they will not accept it. So notice what they're saying. The League of Nations would bind bind the United States to all of these other foreign interests. Okay. There is another group called the reservationists. In particular, Henry Cabot Lodge is part of this, who opposed the treaty with the League of Nations as it is already set. They believe that if you adjusted Article 10 of the treaty, which is about the League of Nations, if you adjust that to where it does not obligate the United States military to take action in another country, then the US would be okay with it. Okay, so these would be the reservationists. And then, of course, you've got people who would have supported the League of Nations. So look at this cartoon, interrupting the ceremony. So we've got the League of Nations and we've got foreign entanglements. And then here would be Uncle Sam joining in with these foreign entanglements. And if any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, like they're at a wedding of some sort. And here comes the United States Senate crashing through with their reservations and these irreconcilables, saying this is a terrible idea for the United States. So Wilson goes across the entire country for a couple of months, exhaustively speaking out in favor of the League of Nations to be passed as it was written and to join in with this international organization. And the exhaustion catches up with him and he has a massive stroke. He doesn't die, but he is severely, his health is compromised to the point that he really is not governing very well. His cabinet members are really the ones calling the shots here. And ultimately, the United States Congress rejects the treaty. So the United States never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. We do not join the League of Nations. So when the United States rejects the treaty and we do not join the League of Nations, does the League of Nations form anyway? And the answer is yes. The League of Nations forms without the United States as a member. So let me ask you a question. Coming out of World War I, which country is the strongest country economically and militarily? Whose country is in the best shape coming out of all of this? Well, it's the United States. So if the United States is not a member of this organization that's tasked with maintaining peace in the world, how effective is this organization going to be? Probably not very effective. All right, so let's look at this. The gap in the bridge. You've got Belgium, France, England, Italy, but the key to it is the United States. And so without the United States in here, this League of Nations bridge is not going to be very strong. All right, so there we have it. There is chapter 20, all of those foreign affairs, the multiple wars that we've talked about. So again, think about the role of the United States in the world and how that changes and how it stays the same from all of those previous elements of foreign policy going all the way back to George Washington. So keep all of that in mind. All right, keep reading and go make history.